From China to North Korea to Iran, and let's not forget the global pandemic, President Biden has many policy challenges, foreign policy challenges, that is. We haven't even brought up Syria yet, a conflict he's been accused of putting on the back burner despite a decade of war that has left hundreds of thousands dead and no change in Syrian leadership. The conflict in Syria over the last decade has been a brutal one. Chemical weapons were even used despite proclamations from President Biden's former boss, Barack Obama, that unleashing them would be crossing a red line. Relentless suffering, relentless conflict, and as Ian Pannell shows us, children caught in the middle throughout it all.
It looks like a normal day at a regular elementary school where happy fourth graders are learning English. But this is no ordinary school, and not all classes here are quite so much fun. In America, some school children must learn what to do if there's an active shooter. But here in northern Syria, they must learn what to do if they're about to be bombed. Today, this is just a rehearsal. But it's a life-saving lesson because more than 1,500 schools and colleges have been targeted or damaged in Syria's war, most of them by the regime. And in 10 years of conflict, nearly 12,000 children have been killed or injured. It started peacefully. As the Arab Spring swept into Syria in 2011, protests for basic freedoms and rights began. But when a group of children sprayed graffiti against the ruling Assad family, the regime showed its hand. The boys were arrested, imprisoned and tortured. And when more peaceful protests erupted, the regime then opened fire. Syria spiraled into a brutal civil war. An armed rebellion emerged with weapons, funding and training from the Gulf and Europe. The regime doubled down in a fight for survival with weapons, bombs and fighters from Iran, Hezbollah and Russia. We witnessed Syria's descent into chaos firsthand in the country's second city of Aleppo as rebel fighters and regime troops battled for control.
The rebels have now moved up because the government's been trying to push into this area.
In a desperate move, the regime started using industrial-scale warfare with civilians increasingly targeted. We saw innocent people, their homes, even their hospitals being attacked with attack helicopters and fighter jets as the ranks of the dead and the wounded mounted.
The situation inside here is one of unbelievable chaos.
The world watched in horror. It condemned and criticized. And then President Obama issued his infamous warning.
We have been very clear to the Assad regime, but also to other players on the ground that a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized.
A year later, it happened, with horrific images emerging of adults and children choking and dying from what the UN says was sarin gas and weaponized chlorine. Further attacks were blamed on the Syrian regime, something it still denies. Despite a red line being clearly crossed, Obama settled for a Russian broken deal and the slaughter of civilians by both sides, but overwhelmingly the regime resumed. Robert Ford was America's ambassador to Syria at the time.
What is the lesson? What are the possibilities here?
On the chemical weapons attack and the red line, I think the most important lesson from that is that leaders of any country should be very careful about language they spell out, defining red lines if they're not prepared to back them up. It quickly became apparent that there was a very big disparity between the Obama administration's rhetoric and what the Americans were actually willing to do on the ground.
The few American troops that had been in Syria to support anti-terror groups were largely pulled out under the Trump administration, leaving Russia to fill the void. But the killing didn't stop. More than 500,000 people have been killed in the last 10 years. More than 14,000 by torture. Nasser Abdul Karim Speer survived to tell his story. It's as painful as it is familiar. He spent years of his life in and out of Syrian prisons. Most recently, arrested in 2014 during the uprising and jailed for 2 years.
I was at home, and suddenly soldiers surrounded the house. They pointed guns at me, and they were ordered to take me out of the house.
They broke his kneecap, he says, and he says he was regularly beaten because he could no longer walk.
It still affects me very much. It was deeply distressing. It was extremely hard, being beaten while not being able to walk or run like the rest of the detainees.
He's now joined thousands of others in Atme refugee camp in the Turkish border. The slaughter and displacement unleashed an exodus not witnessed for decades. And the vacuum left in parts of rebel-held Syria was increasingly filled by the black flag of the Islamic State. The group conquering large swaths of Syria and Iraq, murdering, raping and pillaging in the name of a twisted theology. Ethnic minorities recounting horrific stories of sexual enslavement and torture. And while the Syrian people were crying out for help, the world largely stood by and watched.
Bashar al-Assad has maintained his seat on power. In his terms, he has won. He is not going to be removed. He's going to win a sham election later this spring, and he will be there for at least 7 more years. They need to stop thinking that somehow the Americans or the West are going to save them. The U.S. Air Force is not going to start bombing Damascus.
Dr. Taraf al-Taraf works for the Syrian American Medical Society in Idlib, northern Syria, where most civilians displaced by the war now live. We can't say where exactly because the clinic is at risk of being attacked.
I lost many of my friends and loved ones. Those were very difficult times. And even I sometimes don't want to remember it.
He's been working in hospitals since the start of the war. He's lost his brother and 2 colleagues, all of them working as medics. Hundreds of facilities have been targeted. Clinics like this now depend on the same early warning system being installed in schools in northern Syria. And yet, incredibly, Dr. Taraf still has hope.
Although of all the difficulties that we lived in the last 10 years, yes, I still hopeful. I'm hopeful because hope is all we have. I believe that this tragedy will end someday, soon or later, and the Syrians will regain their freedom and build a country that respects its citizens and their rights.
More than half the country has been displaced by this war, and this vast, sprawling camp along the Turkish border is now home to many of them. Children who know nothing but war, violence and insecurity, now living in this vast city of Tarpaulin.
عايشين صرنا 8 سنين هون بهاي المخيم عمري 10 سنين.
The camp now large enough to be seen by satellite, but still out of sight. After the worst 10 years imaginable, millions of people are stranded on the edge of Europe, still largely ignored, marginalised, and living each day in fear for their lives. Ian Pannell for ABC News.
What a tragedy. Our thanks to Ian.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.